that the story of Ruth took place. The histories of Samuel and Kings and Chronicles cover the same time frame, but with different details. Ezra begins exactly where 2 Chronicles leaves off, verbatim. Did you ever notice this before? Let me show you a slide. Okay, this is 2 Chronicles, the very last verses of the book of 2 Chronicles, and I don't expect you to be able to read all that from where you're sitting. But I want you to notice the word now in yellow. That's the only part of these two verses that does not appear in the first verses of the book of Ezra. I want you to notice at the bottom of those verses that open the book of Ezra, text that does not occur in 2 Chronicles. And it starts mid-sentence. It's as if the writer stopped mid-sentence with writing 2 Chronicles and began writing Ezra in exactly the same place, overlapping the text in 2 Chronicles, but then continuing the sentence in his writing. That's a curiosity. More modern scholarship has shown that when you have more information than will fit on one scroll, you don't trash the scroll and start over on a bigger one. Too much invested in getting that information on one scroll. No, the accepted practice was to continue the text on another scroll and to overlap some of the text so that the reader knows that it's intentional, that the second scroll is to pick up where the first one left off. So Chronicles and Ezra are one storyline. Okay, now let's do a quick overview of today's lesson. I'm going to introduce two major texts from which we get our Old Testament, because if we want to understand our Old Testament, we'll help to know the material that it comes from. A logical progression to explain the layout of this portion of the Old Testament. You can follow me through that, and we're going to take it slow because it is complicated. If at any time you don't understand or if there are questions that you want to ask, flag me down. I'm glad for you to ask questions. Third, finally, the purpose is to understand why Kings and Chronicles are the same but different. I think that's really critically important to understand why they're the same but different. Why are they the same and why are they different? We're going to see if we can figure that out. Well, don't you think that will help us to illuminate the differences between the two texts and the similarities between the two texts as we go through this series of studies? That's what we're going to try to do. So let's talk for a minute about source text for the Old Testament, but before we do that, let's go to God in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the honor and the privilege of holding your inspired words in our hands, to be able to read them with the confidence that we can know that these are the thoughts that you thought, that you passed down to your holy apostles and prophets, and that they wrote them down reliably in a few words so that when we read, we can perceive their knowledge in the mystery. We thank you, Lord, for the privilege of doing this together with our brothers and sisters, because we realize that abroad, not everyone has that privilege. And we thank you for that. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so I want to talk about two main source texts for our Old Testament. And these are source texts, the names of which you'll recognize if you've been a Bible student for a while. The first one is the Masoretic text. And this is written in Hebrew. It was compiled between the 6th and 10th centuries AD. So it's not that ancient, the text that we have, in relationship to when these events actually took place, Old Testament having ended about the turn of the millennium, but around 0 AD, right? If there is such a thing. So 600 years later, the Masoretes began writing down the details of how to pronounce Hebrew words in the Hebrew text, And that's the text that has been eventually preserved for us as the Masoretic text. And then the other most reliable and complete text is the Septuagint. You've all heard of the Septuagint likely. It was written in Koine Greek, the common Greek, around the mid-3rd century BC. So this text actually existed at the time the apostles and Jesus walked the earth. Okay? And so it's a very ancient text, but of course being written in Greek and the Masoretic in Hebrew gives us kind of a linguistic comparison between the two writings to see how reliable they are and how much variation has occurred in the text over time. Then there are some other minor texts from which our Old Testament is compiled, and although these didn't have as much direct influence as the Masoretic and the Septuagint had, they were used to cross-check to some extent the reliability of the text again. And so here are some other texts, not that these are the only ones. There are something like 5,000 of them altogether, most of them fragmentary, but these are the ones that exist in mass. We have the Syriac text, so southern part of Asia Minor, where a lot of war is going on right now in Syria, that part of the country. The Samaritan Pentateuch, that's right, the Samaritans had their own version of the Pentateuch, and there are some variations, some differences between that and the Masoretic text, but that exists largely as a body of literature, 5 books of the Old Testament, the writings of Moses. And then the Syriac Peshitta was written in a version of Aramaic. So we've got 3 different languages being represented here. A Syriac, an Aramaic, and a Samaritan language that can also be used to cross-check the reliability of the text and can add verity to this or that source. But we're going to focus mainly on those first 2 because they're the ones that exist as a body that contain the entire Old Testament. And the Masoretic text is important for a number of reasons. Again, it was written in Hebrew, and if you see the abbreviation MT as we go through these slides, that's Masoretic text, and that's the way that it'll occur in the religious literature. It's the present authoritative Hebrew Bible. In other words, it's the one that the rabbis teach from in their classes in the synagogues now. It's still accepted as the Hebrew Bible. Okay? And it's the one that they place all of their authority behind. It's not that they completely discard the use of the Septuagint, but this is their Bible. It was compiled from pre-existing Hebrew manuscripts that are no longer available to us. So we have this compilation from earlier manuscripts, but we don't have the manuscripts from which it was compiled. It's used as the basis for most Protestant translations of the Old Testament, and that includes the King James, the American Standard Version, the New American Standard Version, the ESV is the one that I like and the one that I'll be using during this class, and the NIV also is translated from the Masoretic text. Okay, so very important in terms of Protestant literature. And then by comparison, the Septuagint, as I said, was written in Greek, and you'll see it represented as LXX, and that, again, that's the way in the religious literature, that's the way that it's often represented. It's the Roman numeral for 70. So you got a Greek Bible that's represented in Roman numerals, a little confusing, I know. But nevertheless, the Septuagint is the oldest complete known version of the Old Testament. And a representative text is the Leningrad Codex, which was written down somewhere around about 1008 AD, written on parchment. It was made from pre-existing Hebrew manuscripts by Jews in Alexandrian Egypt. So around the time of Alexander the Great is when this was written, again, before Jesus, before the apostles. And so it's used as the basis for the Orthodox Old Testament. Makes sense. The Orthodoxes are centered in Greece. They speak Greek, so they're going to use the Septuagint as their Bible, right? It was also used as the basis for the translation of the Latin version of the Old Testament, the Vulgate. which was then in turn used as the basis for the Roman Catholic Bible. And if you want to know why the Roman Catholic Bible has more books in it than our Old Testament, it's because it was based on the Septuagint, and the Septuagint actually has those books in it, preserved from 3 BC. So even though the Masoretes, the Jews, did not accept those books into their canon, the Greek church and the Roman church still have those books in their canon because they relied on the Septuagint. Both the Hebrew, the Masoretic text, and the ancient Hebrew and Septuagint texts were quoted, paraphrased, and in the case of the Hebrew text, translated on the fly. You know, the Apostle Paul is speaking to people in Greek. He could do that. It's pretty cool. Spoke Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. And so he could quote the Septuagint, the Old Testament text on the fly, so it might not occur exactly as it appears in the Masoretic text, but it won't match the Septuagint either. Why? Because Paul was quoting it reliably from his sources that are older than the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. You see? So Paul used it often, used the Masoretic text, but he also used the Septuagint extensively, as did other New Testament authors. There is no evident intent, now this is important, there's no evident intent by New Testament authors to establish one source text over another. You'll never see Paul say, now this is the reliable version, so this is the one I want you to read from. You'll never hear him say, use the Greek text because it's the one that suits you the best. That never happens anywhere in the New or Old Testaments. There's never a time when there is one text that is highlighted above the others. And I think that's important for us. Can you imagine what would happen if the Septuagint, if one of the writers said, okay, I want you to use the Septuagint, and another writer, for another reason, whatever reason, said, I want you to use the Masoretic text. Well, of course, it wasn't Masoretic back then. It was the ancient Hebrew text. The confusion that might cause. No, the writers just quoted from the sources that they had and for the audience that they were teaching. So if you're teaching to a Greek audience, maybe you'll quote from the Septuagint. Or maybe you'll translate the Septuagint into another language. The apostles had that ability too, you recall. They could speak in other languages as the Spirit chose to lead them to do so. So there's no evident intent by New Testament authors to establish one source text over another, but rather to convey their message using the texts that were accessible, both physically and linguistically, to the audience. Some audiences might have had a copy of the Hebrew scrolls, and maybe they had somebody in their congregation who spoke Hebrew and were able to read from those scrolls. Or maybe they didn't have a Hebrew scroll at all. Maybe they only had Greek scrolls because they were living out in the heather somewhere. So the apostles used the material that was available to them physically, but also accessible to them linguistically. They had to pick and choose versions to quote from or to paraphrase from as the situation required it. When we read our Bible, we just don't think about all this, do we? We just read it. And we accept that it's reliable. And it is reliable. And the reason we know it's reliable is because we have all these other texts to show us that it's reliable. Both texts are valuable, both the Masoretic and the Septuagint, and both have had effects on our Old Testament as seen in the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. I'm going to show you now one example of how both of these texts have influenced what we hold today in our hands and call the Bible. Okay. Now follow me through this. On the top you see a series of texts in order. You have the ancient Hebrew texts, from which eventually we get the Masoretic. We have the Greek Septuagint, began to be translated at about 250 BC. We have the Latin Vulgate, which is translated much into the New Testament period, into the post-New Testament period, I should say. And we have Protestant translations that begun with the work of Martin Luther in 1517. That's why that date is mentioned. That's when Martin Luther translated the Hebrew texts into German. Okay? And beginning with that, we have a whole spate of Protestant texts that were translated mostly from the Masoretic text. Okay? But notice that over on the left-hand side, that in the ancient Hebrew texts, the book of Samuel appears not as two books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, but only as Samuel. And that's the way it exists in the Masoretic text, which is the way the Jews see it today. The Jews only have one book. They don't have a 1st and 2nd Samuel. They only have a Samuel. Same thing with Kings. They don't have a 1st and 2nd Kings. They only have a Kings. The Septuagint, seeing that those were all the same storyline, the translators decided to compress them all together and put them into one book called the Book of Kingdoms. And that's the way it still appears in the Orthodox Bible today, as the Book of Kingdoms. The Latin Vulgate, from which the Catholic Bible came, decided to divide those into 4 books. Actually, it was one book, but it was in 4 parts. They called it the Book of Kings, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, and Part 4. So Samuel is the Book of Kings, Part 1, First Samuel. 2nd Samuel is the Book of Kings, Part 2, and so on. And then, when Martin Luther translated into German, in the subsequent texts after that, just thought it was convenient to divide it into 4 books. And that's why we have 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. And that's why our Bibles have more books in them. One of the reasons why our Bibles have more books in them than the Jewish Bible that they use today. I don't know if you guys think this is interesting or not. I love it. It's fascinating to know the history of how we got what we have. Content hasn't been affected, just the way it appears in our Bibles and the way we reference it. So you can see how, even though our Old Testament comes from the Masoretic text, the quote-unquote Hebrew Bible, it also contains influences from the Septuagint and from the historical rearrangements made by various translators for their own reasons. So the book you have is mostly from the Masoretic text, the Old Testament, but it has been influenced by all these other influences and translations and retranslations. So the Masoretic text teaches us that the books of the Samuel and Kings might be taken as singular works, as it teaches more than that about Kings and Chronicles, which we will see. That's why I want to take a few minutes and talk about the Masoretic text. Where are you guys at on history this morning? The Hebrew Bible appears in 3 sections. You ever heard this? You all know the first section. Everybody's heard of the Torah, right? The first 5 books, we also call them the Pentateuch, or the books of Moses, because in fact Moses is credited with the writing of those books, even by Jesus himself. Doubt if he recorded his own death, which is recorded in the book of Deuteronomy. Somebody else probably came along and added that after he died. But he's credited with having written down those 5 books. The second portion is called the prophets. Where have you heard this before? As also says the law and the prophets. You heard those words from Jesus, didn't you? We're going to quote a couple of those passages in just a minute. So in Hebrew, Nevi'im. The writings, then, are the 3rd section of the Hebrew Bible, the Ketubim. Now, for example, Ruth is included right along with Numbers in our Bible, but it's not that way in the Masoretic text. It's included among these scrolls called the writings, the Ketubim, as is Daniel, for example. So a number of books that don't occur in the same place in the Hebrew Bible that they occur in ours. And it's because of the way that the Hebrews divided their Bible differently than the ways ours are divided, which are largely based on the Septuagint. Okay? Now let's take a closer look at each one of those sections. As I said before, the law we know, Genesis to Deuteronomy, no surprises there. But here's a surprise. The second section of the Bible, the prophets, is divided into 2 sections, the former prophets and the latter prophets. The former prophets are not necessarily people that you think of as prophets. Joshua, was he a prophet? Were his writings written by a prophet? Possibly. Don't really know why they would reference Joshua in with the prophets. By Hebrew tradition, the book of Joshua was written by Joshua himself. The book of Judges. The judges are often called in the religious literature the charismatic judges, because it'll say the Spirit came upon Gideon, and it will be by the Spirit that Gideon does the things that he does, pushed along, motivated by the Spirit of God. We don't necessarily think of them as prophets, but these are what the Israelites, the Jewish people from ancient times, called the former prophets. And those, of course, include Samuel, whom we know is a prophet, and the book of Kings by Jewish tradition, written by Jeremiah, and then redacted later to include the death of the latter years of Jeremiah. Okay, so I want you to notice Samuel and 2 Kings because they're part of the topic of this class, but they're part of this same storyline that begins in Genesis and then to Exodus and then Leviticus is kind of some messages to the Levites that are stuck in historically at that place, and then Numbers, and then Deuteronomy, where it is a retelling of the law, but it's also contains some history right at the end of the life of Moses. Okay, Joshua takes up in the next position, and then Judges takes up where Joshua leaves off with the completion of the conquest. And at the end of the Judges, we have Samson, Eli, and who? Samuel, which then begins the book of Samuel. It's one continuous storyline all the way through. The latter prophets then are the people that you usually recognize as prophets, and we call these the major prophets, and then the minor prophets are also included among the latter prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, notice that Daniel is missing, Ezekiel is there, and then what the Jews include as one book in their Old Testament that they call the Book of the 12, that we call the minor prophets. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, and so on, all the way through Malachi. This will have some relevance in a minute. All right, so here are the writings. The documents of truth, according to the Hebrew Bible, are Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. Interesting. Documents of truth. It's a fitting title. Then the 5 scrolls, and these are oftentimes called the festal scrolls because each one is read at a different Jewish festival. Okay? Don't ask me why the Song of Songs is read at Passover. I've read some Jewish commentary on that, and let me tell you, it can get way off into the woods. To me, it's still a curiosity. Ruth is read at the Feast of Weeks, which actually makes quite a bit of sense to us because that's their Feast of Harvest. And remember the business about Ruth gleaning in Boaz's field. Lamentations, the Day of Atonement, makes some sense. Ecclesiastes at the Feast of Tabernacles, and Esther at Purim. Well, the Feast of Purim was instituted to celebrate the story of Esther, so it only makes sense that Esther would be read at that feast. All right, and then finally, notice other books. These are stuck in at the end of the Jewish canon. They include Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. And the one thing that I can think of that all these 3 books have in common is that they were written late and perhaps accepted into the Jewish canon late. And I think it may reflect the order in which they were accepted into the Jewish canon, because you'll notice that Chronicles appears before Ezra and Nehemiah. And we just got done saying that Ezra and Nehemiah continue with the story from the book of Chronicles. So it seems like Chronicles should come first. But if Chronicles was accepted into the canon later than Ezra and Nehemiah, then that would explain why it's appearing last. All right. Now you notice I've got Chronicles in yellow because, again, that's the part of the story. So I want you to notice something significant about that. Chronicles is included in the Jewish Bible in a different location, in a different section of their Bible than the books of Samuel and Kings. So it's not just intended to be part of the same telling of the story by a different person. It's actually a different telling of the story at a different time by a different person. These divisions in the Hebrew text are ancient, and they're mentioned in biblical texts themselves. Let me show you a couple first from the Old Testament. This is from Zechariah chapter 7, verses 7 and verse 12. They made their hearts diamond hard, lest they should hear the law and the words that the Lord of hosts had sent to his spirit through the former prophets. So Zechariah, being one of the latter prophets, is speaking of one of the former prophets. Okay, well, maybe that's just coincidence. Here's what Jesus said in Luke chapter 24 and verse 44. Then he said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." He's representing three different sections of the Hebrew Old Testament there. And Jesus very often says something about the law and the prophets. There are about a half a dozen quotations where Jesus references those two sections. So this is real. This is not something that's contrived, not something that's lost on us when we read through the text. We can actually look at the text itself, and we can see that the Bible actually was divided in Jesus' day into these different sections, and that the text that those Hebrew people had available to them would have been divided that way. Okay, so here's some more facts about Old Testament books I think that'll be helpful to us. As shown, 1st and 2nd Samuel are a singular book in the Hebrew Masoretic text of the Bible. Likewise, 1st and 2nd Kings, so we have a book of Samuel and a book of Kings. All four books taken together represent a single storyline, a single narrative. Also as shown, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are a single book in the Masoretic text, just called the Book of Chronicles. And Ezra and Nehemiah are a single book in the Masoretic text. I didn't mention that, but they're not two books, Ezra and Nehemiah. There's one book of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Hebrew text. All four books taken together, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, represent a second narrative. The book of Chronicles begins with a series of genealogies. Something about those genealogies. They begin with Adam. So again, this is not a retelling of the this is not just taking up where the book of Kings left off or emphasizing things that are in the book of Kings. He wants to tell the whole story beginning with Adam. And the first 9 chapters are genealogies that are every time a name is mentioned, a set of stories that these Jews have heard since the time they were children are brought to mind. So when you hear a name given in the genealogies, to us, they just make our eyes glaze over. It's just a list of names. But to them, this is their heritage. This is their equivalent of George Washington and John Adams and John Quincy Adams and Lyndon Johnson. I mean, all the way from the end to the beginning, it brings to me, I say Lyndon Johnson, what do you think of? Vietnam. If I say George Washington, of course, all these images immediately come to mind. And some of them are legend, like George Washington and the cherry tree. Some of them are factual. All of these names that are mentioned in the genealogy of the Chronicles bring a story to life. So the chronicler is taking them back to their beginnings, and he's telling them the story, but he doesn't end where you might expect him to end, where the book of Chronicles actually begins its storyline. He takes it all the way through to the return from exile in his genealogies. Don't let that be lost on you. The chronicler is including by reference to these names the part of the history that is left out of the book of Chronicles of when they were actually in exile. Okay, so he's not writing, not thinking anything about the exile or not being aware of the exile. He's writing knowing the exile and all the things that happened that brought him to where he is, but that's not where he starts his story. He still starts his story with David. and he continues it with Solomon in 2 Chronicles. So they end post-exile. So Chronicles is not contemporaneous with Kings, even though it covers the same period in history. It was not written at the same time. It had to be written later. How could those genealogies have been included in there unless they were included by some redactor? Okay, so now pull out that sheet of paper that I gave you that represents the Bible as two separate storylines. And I think this will make it pretty clear what we've been saying up to this point in time, that when we read that top line, I'll call it the blue narrative, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are one telling of the story, but then Chronicles, which begins at the same time in history as 2 Samuel, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and Ezra and Nehemiah are a second storyline. And neither Kings nor Chronicles covers in any detail at all the captivity, which is out there kind of a third storyline all by itself. Who tells the story of the captivity? There are three authors that tell parts of it. Daniel's one. Ezekiel is another. Ezra talks about a little bit, just to kind of the tail end of it. Nehemiah is the cupbearer and he leaves, but then kind of doesn't tell much of that story. The third one that I was thinking about is Esther. Okay, so it's really not it's really perhaps post return, but it anyway talks about the story in that results from exile. All right, so we have these two separate storylines, and yet, as I say, many of the details in Chronicles and Kings are very similar or even the same. But a lot of it is not, and what we want to try to do here is to try to understand the differences. And we're going to spend more time doing that next week. We've got about 3 minutes here. So we have two overlapping narratives. We have the Joshua, Judges, Samuel narrative, which I call the blue narrative, and we have the Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, or orange narrative. The blue narrative, the books of Samuel and Kings, are actually a single book. The blue narrative moves seamlessly from Genesis to 2 Kings, contiguous from creation to captivity, and fairly straightforward religious history. Now, this is different. Kings will tell us all of the goods and bads of all the people involved. It doesn't try to hide anything. You want to hear the bad stuff about David? Read Kings. You won't read it in Chronicles. You will see nothing in Chronicles about the business between David and Bathsheba. You won't see anything in there about Solomon's unfaithfulness and how his wives led him into idolatry. Interesting. But if you want to read all those details, you go to Kings for that. The orange narrative begins with Adam in the genealogies. Focus begins with David, but doesn't simply add detail to Samuel and Kings. Tells some information about David that we didn't know from those other books, and leaves out much of the bad stuff about David and Solomon. He leaves out anything about Israel that doesn't directly affect Judah. The chronicler doesn't seem to care about Isaiah. It's written post-exile, so the 10 tribes are lost, and we've got the restoration of the people from Babylonian captivity that are mostly from the south. It's all from the kingdom of David, and so why would they go and rehash the history that Kings has already said? What we care about is reestablishing the throne of David and Solomon. All right? So the point of all this is to show that the books of Kings are part of a singular narrative that is contiguous with Samuel. In fact, from Genesis to 2 Kings, the Bible records a single chronological narrative consistent with the Masoretic text. The book of Chronicles is not part of that narrative. Rather, there is a second narrative, Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah, that overlaps the first, written at a different time and for a different purpose. And this is also consistent with the way the Masoretic text is laid out. So we really are missing quite a bit when we don't have the original layout of the books as it's laid out in the Masoretic text. But we also have considerable information that's added and that is verity that is added by the presence of the Septuagint. So both are really important. And that's a good place to end for this morning. Next week, I want to talk to you specifically about the books of Chronicles and talk about looking at those books from a bird's eye view and an overview of the text and highlighting what's unique about those books before we begin that week by week progression through Kings and Chronicles. Thank you.